Cristiano. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to all the participants who joined us today, and big welcome to all of you. So my name is Suchit Anand, and I'm from the Global Open Data for Agriculture and Nutrition. And we are very happy to welcome you all to this RDA's inaugural webinar as part of our webinar series from the IGAD community, the interest group on agriculture data. So we welcome all interested to join the interest group on agriculture data and join our community. So please go to our website. If you go to the RDA website and look at the IGAD interest group on agriculture data, you can join our mail list and you'll be kept updated. So this is the start of this webinar series, and we are very happy to have an excellent speaker and topic for the first webinar, which is focused on the global long-term agriculture experiments network metadata platform that will be presented by Richard Osler. So I want to introduce our speaker for today, Richard Osler from the Rothamsted research. So much of Richard's career has been involved in addressing the challenges of data integration, especially long-term datasets. He started his career as a computational biologist at the UK's Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, working on integrating and mapping biodiversity and geospatial datasets, and in the early 2000s managed the UK's GBIF node of over 25 million biodiversity records. He then moved on to clinical trials and long-term population data before returning to environmental sciences, where he joined Rothamsted Research in 2017. At Rothamsted, Richard is an advocate for the application of fair data principles and leads the Agri-Ecoinformatics group, tasked with improving the discovery, access, and reuse of agri-ecological datasets, in particular for Rothamsted's famous long-term field experiments. Richard has also led development of the Global Long-Term Agriculture Experiments portal, launched in October 2019, and we will be hearing more about this work from Richard now. And I want to also remind all participants that you are more than welcome to ask your questions through the chat window, and after the webinar, we will be able to, Richard will be able to answer these questions after the webinar. So please feel free to send the questions by chat window during the presentation and after the presentations as well. So now I want to hand over to Richard for the presentation he'll be giving. Richard.
Thank you, Sujit, for that very good introduction. And yeah, I'm delighted to be the first presenter for the series. So I'm going to talk about the Global Long-Term Agricultural Experiments Network Metadata Platform today, and give you a bit of insight into the development of the platform, some of the challenges that we've faced along the way and how we're addressing those. But before I do that, I'd like, first of all, to talk about long-term agricultural experiments more generally and why we think they're important. So what are long-term agricultural experiments? Well, to give a very basic working definition, they're generally accepted as experiments that run over a period of at least 10 years. So that's a sort of a minimum period, and have multiple cropping cycles. And they're really there to test treatment effects over an extended period of time. So they're very good at looking at things like the sustainability and resilience of different management practices. And because they run over very long timescales, they're also very good at looking at processes that operate over long decadal timescales, particularly around soils. The experiments are also highly diverse. So the 5 experiments that you can see on the slide at the moment are from 4 continents. Between them, they have 12 different crops. One of them also has agroforestry. A couple of them have grass lays, and one also has grazing livestock. So they're very diverse systems that are being tested. These 5 experiments also have very diverse treatment factors. So the treatment factors being tested here include the comparisons of farming systems, comparisons of cropping systems, irrigation, tillage, organic versus mineral fertilization, crop protection, and different nitrogen fertilization rates. And of the 5 experiments shown here, only one of them, the one at the bottom, which is the IRRI long-term continuous rice experiment, that's the only one that's a monoculture. All the others are testing various different crops in some form of rotation. It's also worth mentioning one of the two types of treatment factor that you'll very rarely see in this sort of experiment. So the first is novel pest control products. These experiments aren't really used for that kind of testing. And variety trials. So breeding type trials are very rarely seen in the long-term experiments world. So from the Rothamsted experience, we know that long-term experiments, and more specifically the data and the samples that are produced from these experiments, can be repurposed to address questions well beyond the experiment's original research question. So the experiments at Rothamsted, for example, have been used to ask questions ranging from nutrient cycling, the evolution of disease resistance, weed species dynamics, and even temporal patterns of radioactive fallout. And that's just looking at individual experiments in isolation. But we think, going back to what I said earlier, if long-term experiments can look at processes which operate over decadal timescales, then perhaps they're well positioned to look at some of the big societal challenges of the 21st century. So in particular, things like climate change, soil health, biodiversity loss, and food security. And so if we can take data from lots of different long-term experiments, perhaps there's an opportunity to address some of these questions about how we feed ourselves sustainably while staying within safe planetary boundaries. And this is one of the main objectives for setting up this global network in the first place. And we know that there is some evidence that this is a case, that taking these experiments and combining the data can help answer some of these questions. So again, using Rothamsted as an example, colleagues at Rothamsted evaluated 16 of our long-term experiments to assess the feasibility of achieving the 4 per 1,000 initiative for increasing soil organic carbon. So this is an initiative which looks to increase soil organic carbon stocks in the top 40 centimetres of soil over a 20-year period as a way of mitigating against climate change. So the study looked at data from 16 of Rothamsted's long-term experiments. The experiments, while they're all from a very similar climate, had very contrasting soil types, contrasting cropping systems, and contrasting management systems. And they found that looking at these different farming systems from these different experiments, there were major limitations to achieving this target for increasing soil organic carbon in temperate regions. But it's important, I think, to note that this study was based on experiments from just one research institute. So again, one of the challenges that we face is how we would go about scaling research like this out to the global scale. And again, this is one of the objectives for the Global Long-Term Experiments Network. And we know that there's a lot of experiments out there, long-term agricultural experiments out there. So this is a very incomplete map, but what I hope it shows you is that long-term agricultural experiments are very well distributed across all continents and cover most of the agriculturally important biomes as well. But when we set up the network, so we had an original plan to do some meta-analyses using data from several experiments to look at sustainability across different cropping systems. But at a very early stage, we found that finding information about these experiments was very difficult, far more difficult than it really should be. So if you go and do a speculative Google search for long-term agricultural experiments, then you'll get a lot of non-open access academic publications, and you'll get a lot of pretty irrelevant hits. So Googling information about long-term experiments doesn't really yield a good set of results. There are some other existing networks. So in particular, for example, there's the SOMNet network, the Soil Organic Matter network. But as far as we're concerned, it's effectively a dead network. The online data that's available for the network is really just a snapshot of a publication from 2001. So it's already very out of date now. And as experiment manager, we have no way of updating the content that's on the metadata site. the site itself is also technologically very outdated as well. So there's no, for example, API access for discovering any of the data. And again, the focus of SOMNet is on soils, it's not agriculture. And so many of the experiments that we might be interested in aren't covered because they're not purely about the soil. And this is true for other networks as well in other related domains. So for example, the long-term ecological research community, again, is very relevant to us, but the scope is slightly different. So a lot of agricultural experiments are missed from this particular network. And another problem with, as far as we're concerned with the LTER network, is a lot of the sites in this network are observation sites, not experimental or intervention sites, which is the case for long-term agricultural experiments. So a lot of the critical metadata that we might want to capture about the experiment, such as the cropping systems, the experiment design, aren't covered by things like the LTER networks. But at a national and an institutional scale, things are a lot better. So in Germany, for example, you've got the Bonares portal, which is very comprehensive. The metadata is curated, but it is local to the German context. And again, at Rothamsted, we have our own metadata portal. It's comprehensive, but it's local to our own institute context. So while there are good resources out there, they're quite disjointed. So what we really want to do is try and bring these kinds of networks together and then fill in and provide a platform to fill in the gaps for all the other experiments which don't have any kind of network support. So this is really the idea behind the GLTEN metadata portal. So what we envisage for the portal is to be an open and standards-based infrastructure that can start to address this capacity gap, this problem of finding long-term agricultural experiments. So it's really there to serve two purposes. It's there to support the discovery of long-term experiments and to facilitate access to the data from these experiments. But we also hope as well that there might be a drive to improve the data quality and the curation of data from these long-term agricultural experiments. So what is the GLTEN metadata portal? Well, we see it in the first instance as an infrastructure for long-term experiment managers to register and document their experiments. And we do this by providing a rich metadata format which details the experiment history, the purpose of the experiment, its design, the different treatment factors that are used, and can also characterize the environment in terms of its soil and climate, and give an indication of the types of data which might be available. And as far as possible, we've tried to do this using existing standards. What the GLTEN metadata portal is not is a data grab. So at the moment, we're only asking for the metadata for the experiments. The long-term experiment managers remain in control of the data and how that data is accessed. So if it's an infrastructure to allow managers to register and document their experiments, it's also an infrastructure to allow researchers to discover those long-term experiments and connect with long-term experiment managers. So we're trying to facilitate the engagement between researcher and long-term experiment manager and the exchange of information and data and enable collaborations to really get this data being used more widely and really show the value and impact of these experiments. We also want the portal to be culturally and technologically open. So what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, this isn't to be seen as a Rothamsted initiative. We have the GLTEN project was established by an international consortium, and we now have an international steering committee with representation from all continents and with a good gender balance. And this steering committee is really there to guide and oversee the future development of the network. The network itself is free to join, There's no financial cost to joining the network. The only things that you need to have in place is an experiment which has been running for at least 10 years and a willingness to share data at some level. The platform itself will be made open source. Well, I've got November on here, and hopefully that's still going to be the case, but certainly by the end of the year. So all the code that we've used to build the platform will be made available. And so if we're no longer able to sustain it, then we can at least pass it on. And again, the hosting for the platform is in the cloud rather than on an institute server. We also have an open query API for the portal as well. So as well as having the web front end, we can use it as an infrastructure to support other networks as well. So we can use that API to serve data and be interoperable with other platforms. So we're really, in terms of being a sustainable platform, we're really trying to learn from the mistakes, in a way, of other networks. And so we hope building an open platform will foster this sustainable network infrastructure. In terms of funding, we're currently funded by a philanthropic charitable grant, which covers the costs of Carolina, our network coordinator, and the ongoing the cost of the initial development. The ongoing IT costs for us are actually relatively low now, but we're looking to support this using things like Amazon grants for research and education. But the portal also needs community support. It needs people to use it. So we need a critical mass of experiments in there. We need a positive reception, which I'm pleased to say so far has been the case. When we launched, we had just over 50 experiments. We're now up to 65, with quite a few more in the pipeline. We've also been discussing with a couple of other networks. So there's good interest in using this within the community to use this platform. But it's true that data sharing concerns do exist, but as a general rule, the people that the long-term experiment managers we've spoken to are very keen to share their data. So yes, there are concerns about misrepresentation of data, but they're not as great as I think we were expecting. But there is a caveat to this, and that's the concern at the amount of work that's required to mobilize data and a lack of resources or skills to do this. So quite often when we've spoken to people, they've got quite long-term sets of data, but they haven't been well curated over the long term. So often the data is, sometimes it may be on paper, often it's in things like Excel spreadsheets. And the LTE managers lack the resources to publish the data and describe the data in a sort of a meaningful way. So this is a capacity gap that we've started to identify as we've been reaching out to different long-term experiments. Okay, so we'll get a bit more technical now. So the GLTEN Metadata Domain. So this image hopefully gives you an overview of the kinds of metadata that we're looking to capture. So we're trying to capture information for an experiment about the cropping system, about the design and the treatments, the kind of samples and data that are available, the environment in terms of its climate and soil, where the experiment is and when it was, is it ongoing or has it finished? And we're also capturing metadata about the access to the data that's been generated from the experiment and licensing and contacts for that data. So in a bit more detail, the GLTEN metadata schema that we've developed and drives the metadata portal, the core of this is the DataCite schema. So DataCite schema, so if you're not aware, is the schema which supports dataset DOIs. This schema gives us a ready-made template for capturing a lot of the administrative information that we would want to we would want to gather for an experiment. So it's things like a description of the experiment, the organisations and the people involved, where the experiment is located, the temporal coverage for the experiment, any associated publications for the experiment, and the data access and licensing. But it doesn't go into the kind of detail that we want to capture for the experiment design and the site characterisation. So to do that, we've extended the schema to capture all of this additional information on the crops, the cropping system, the design, the characterisation and the measurements. And as far as possible, we've tried to use existing standards to do this. So particular standards that we've used are plant trait ontology and experimental conditions ontology, which are managed by the Plantiome project, AgriVoc, environment ontology, and the agronomy ontology. But as we've been going through using various test case experiments, we've quite often found that while these ontologies are generally pretty good in their coverage, that's not always the case. There's quite often been missing terms that we would want to add. So we've been working as far as possible with the ontology maintainers and vocabulary maintainers to try and start filling some of these gaps. And generally that's been a pretty good process. I think there's a couple of people involved in that on the call as well. So I'm just going to try a very quick live demo now to give you a feel of the metadata portal. So just bear with me a second. No, that's not right. Okay, so hopefully you can see a map showing various points. So this is the GLTEN metadata portal. So you can hopefully see that there's a fairly basic search feature on here. So if I type in tillage, and we can see that we've reduced down to 26 of the 65 experiments, which are using tillage as a treatment factor of some kind. I can further filter down to include experiments which are looking at tillage and maize. And then if I click on one of these plots, I can go in and I can see the metadata for that experiment. So as you can see, there's a very basic description here. We've got information about the data access, the data licensing and the data access policy, information on the organisation and the contacts, and then we move down to information about the site location. So all of this so far is fairly standard metadata, which we can capture using the DataCite schema. But as we move down, we move into the more detailed metadata that we're capturing. So we've got information about the soil type. So this is just the FAO soil classification, but we can add a more detailed descriptive narrative for the soil description. We can also add soil properties, measured soil properties. So you can see here we have clay content. I think that depth might be a little bit off, but we have a value, so clay content is about 23% for this field. And again, we have a similar set of properties for the climate. So we've got information about the air temperature and precipitation. We then move down to the experiment design. So we have a design type, experimental design type. So this is a split plot design experiment. There's again a narrative to give a bit more detail about that design. We've got information on the number of plots, the number of replicates and the number of harvests each year. And then the cropping as well. So maize, wheat and soybeans are the three crops grown in this experiment. And there are in fact 4 different rotations. And you'll note that we treat monocrop as a one-phase rotation here. And then as we go down, we've got information on the types of experimental factors. So in this case, we have tillage process as one of the factors. So we've had 3 different treatments, multiple plough, no till and chisel plough. And we also have a nitrogen fertilizer treatment as well. So no nitrogen or nitrogen applied at either 90 or 100 kilograms depending on the crop. And there's also an indication of the kind of data available here. So in this case, there's information on the grain yield trait. What I hope this shows as well is the variability of the different treatment factors involved. So I'll come onto that a little bit more in a moment. Okay, so what you didn't really see in that demonstration is the actual semantic annotation going on. So in this screenshot, it's a different experiment, and you can see again the design type, the cropping, and the different treatment factors and measurements that are being made. So again, we've got an NPK fertilizer exposure in this case, and we've also got alley cropping as a treatment factor. But in the background, a lot of this has been annotated using various controlled vocabularies. So we can see that the design type is annotated with a term imported from agronomy ontology. The maize and the cowpeas both map to terms from AgriVoc. And again, the same with the different treatment factors. So everything within this is, as far as we can, has been annotated in a semantic way. And this means that we can start to collect data across experiments, or metadata across experiments, in a much more formal and standard way, so we can start to link across them. So capturing information about the different treatment factors, so the different interventions which have been manipulated within the experiment has been one of the biggest challenges, I think, in this project. And this is really down to the big variability and variation in the different types of treatment which are used, because within a long-term agricultural experiment, pretty much anything that you do as a piece of standard management could be used as a treatment factor. So anything to do with tillage, anything to do with the planting, whether it's the seed rate, the time of planting, or again with fertilizer or pesticide applications, all of these things can be used as a treatment. So they can all be manipulated in some way. And so trying to capture as much information as we can about these things has been quite a challenge. So we have 2 different levels for this. So at the top level we have the treatment factor, and then below that we can specify the different variants or categories within that treatment factor. So it could be nitrogen fertilizer exposure is the treatment factor, and then below that we have different levels of nitrogen exposure. So 75 kilograms per hectare, 150 kilograms per hectare, and so on. Alternatively, it could be a categorical treatment factor, as is the case with tillage. So tillage would be the treatment factor, and below that we have factor categories, which might be conservation tillage, no tillage, conventional tillage. And we can capture additional information here about things like the timing, the crops that particular treatment would be applied to, the application method, and the chemical form as well. Okay, so next steps for the network. So we launched the metadata portal in the start of October, and we're now really trying to reach out to other long-term experiments and other long-term experiment networks to grow this network. We're continuing to develop the schema and the portal. So we have an API, which outputs JSON data, but there's a few improvements that we need to do to this. The key one being is including all the concept URI. So at the moment we only have the labels in there. So that's quite an important tweak we need to make fairly soon. We also want to do things like improve the searching. So at the moment it's a very basic free text, but we would like to add more faceted searching on there. So particularly as more experiments are added, this will become a much more powerful way of navigating through and selecting different experiments. We're also looking at DOI minting. So what we are thinking of doing is providing DOIs for the metadata descriptions as they're added to the experiment. And I think one nice thing of taking this approach is we can use the DOI as a hook for linking the experiment to the research objects which are generated from that experiment, whether it's other publications in journals or whether it's data sets or even samples. If they can reference that DOI, then it gives us a mechanism for completing the narrative really of an experiment in terms of its data and its research outputs. So we're not currently hosting any data, but I think this is becoming more of an open question now, is whether we should be hosting data, and if so, how we go about doing this, because we know that there are a number of experiments which would like to publish their data but don't really have the resources to do that. And so that leads on again to this issue of capacity development. So we know that there's evidence of a skills and resourcing gap for LTE data curation. And interestingly, this doesn't appear to be a north-south divide. It's a global problem. I was at a conference fairly recently, and people in the US and people in sub-Saharan Africa were having exactly the same problems in understanding how they should be curating their data sets. So clearly, if there is demand for long-term experiment data sets, then we've got to fill these gaps for curating data and publishing data. And we recently submitted a BBSRC GCRF proposal with Sequoia University in Tanzania to try and develop a data science for long-term experiments. So this will be looking at not just data management for long-term experiments, but also the design and the analysis of these experiments. So we're waiting to hear back from that at the moment. So to conclude then, so we believe that long-term data and experiments can be repurposed, and we can use these experiments to really address some of the big challenges that we're facing today. And this is one of the core objectives of the GLTEN project as a whole. And combining data and knowledge and resources can add value to individual long-term experiments. It can really make the fullest use of them and really deliver impact from them. And the GLTEN metadata portal is really there as an infrastructure to facilitate this. So it's there to support the discovery of long-term experiments, to facilitate access to the experiment data, and hopefully start to drive improvements in data quality. So I'd like to thank the Rothamsted and IRI team who were originally involved in developing some of the schema and the portal, the steering committee for the GLTEN. A shout out to some of the ontology developers who've also supported us, and also to our funders Percy, BBSRC and the Lord's Agricultural Trust. So thank you. And there's links to the website and the public API and email and contacts as well. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard, for this very informative presentation, and it was really good to see the demo you showed as well. For me, because for me as somebody who doesn't have any knowledge on this area, it was really helpful for me to understand when you show the demo as well. So thank you very much for your presentation. And I want to now give the opportunity to participants of our webinar. If you have questions, please send through the chat window, your questions through the chat window, and Richard will be more than happy to answer those questions. So if you want to speak as well, if you inform, we can enable microphone for you, but please send through the chat window so we know, which of you are interested to ask questions. So in the meanwhile, I have one question for Richard. Richard, because I think in a way, having a presentation for this RDA's first webinar series is really good, because a lot of colleagues who might not be aware of this work will now hopefully be aware of this work. And because we are recording this webinar, and we will make sure the recording of this webinar is made available later, we really hope that will enable some colleagues around the world who might not be aware of this initiative to contact you with your contact details provided, and that hopefully will provide more colleagues to join and link with the initiatives that you're doing. So I want to ask you on for example, this IGAT community. From your perspective, how do you think the IGAT community can help? Because I was especially interested in the capacity development example you said in the last part of your presentation. Is there any things which you think from your perspective that the IGAT community can provide this initiative?
Okay, yeah, I think the IGAT community has been really helpful, actually. Initially, from just a networking point of view, it's got me in touch with quite a few good, relevant people in the community, particularly on the semantics side. So I think in the first instance, the agri-semantics activities within IGAT have been very, very helpful to the work that we've been doing. And I've had quite a lot of support from that community. I think that going forward, the capacity development is certainly an area that we're starting to flag up as being problematic. As I mentioned, a good example, I suppose, is when we've been talking to people quite a couple of times now. We've had people say, my colleague has been running this experiment for 20 years. They're getting close to retirement now, and they've got all this data. What do we do with it? So it's just basic questions like that. How do you go about? How do we support people to first of all curate those data sets into a good shape, and then go about publishing them? And how do we train the long-term experiment managers and resource that training so that they can really make the most of their data sets? So I think that could be an area where, again, the IGAT community through the capacity development working group can be quite helpful.
Thank you, Richard. And I have one more question, because I saw that you have submitted this BBSRC proposal. So is that proposal for example, are you looking for planning, like if that proposal is successful, are you thinking of training programs specifically focused on this, or is it like a face-to-face training program or online training program? So what was the kind of thinking behind it?
Yeah, so the thinking behind it is, so it is a sort of a trainer program. So what we would be, the plan that we submitted with GLTEN was to develop a training course looking around statistical design of long-term experiments, the analysis of long-term experiment data, and the curation of long-term experiment data. So the project was primarily focused at SADC countries. So the plan is to have a work work group and a series of tutorials and lessons at GLTEN. We would then identify several key people from that who we would then develop as trainers. So they would come up to Rothamsted be funded to come to Rothamsted for a couple of months, I think it is, where they'd get more intensive training on statistics and data management and experiment design, and then they would be able to go back and spread that knowledge. So that's the idea behind that proposal. But for us, it would also give us a good set of training materials that we could hopefully reuse elsewhere.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you. So there are some questions coming in. So Benjamin from Namibia is asking, what if I'm interested to join but do not have a long-term experiment yet, or my experiment is not up to 10 years?
Okay, that's a good question. So we're having a little bit of an internal discussion, and I think this will be discussed with the steering committee. So there are a group of experiments that we've identified that may have funding, which will take them up to about 10-year period. So it's a question of whether we should include those or not. The metadata portal itself is completely free to access. So if you want to just go and look on there and try and find experiments that might have useful data for you to use, then anyone can go and do that. I would say probably the best thing to do, Benjamin, is if you email the GLTEN coordinator, so Carolina, I can see has put the email in there. So if you email Carolina with a bit more information about your experiment, then we can discuss that from there.
Right. Thank you, Richard. In fact, there is a text message from this the GLTEN coordinator. So there's an email in that one, glten@rothamsted.ac.uk. Is that the one they have to email?
Yes. Yeah.
So Benjamin, you should be able to go to that email and send your details, and you'll get more details from the initiative as well. So
yeah, sorry, I should put that on the slide.
No worries. So Richard, another question I have is, because you mentioned currently this project is funded now, but so you are actively putting, I understand, through this BBSRC, you are now putting proposals to find more funding for this, to extend this, right?
Yeah, so we have funding for, I think, another year or so for Carolina's post. So we're looking to try and extend that. So whether we continue to get funding from the current source or whether we have to go out elsewhere, we're actively looking continue to look for new sources of funding to continue to support the network.
Right. Okay. Thank you. So colleagues who are in the participants, please, if you have questions, please send, if you want to raise your hand, or if you want to ask the questions using your microphone, let us know, so then we can enable microphone access for you. So if you inform us through the chat window, I will be able to know that. And Cristiano, who is also from FOIO, he'll be able to, who is the host of the webinar, we will be able to give you microphone access for any colleagues who want to ask any specific questions to Richard directly. So Richard, in the meanwhile, can I also ask, from your experience, of this, what was your biggest challenge to get this effort off the ground?
Finding the money in the first case. Yes. So particularly for the metadata portal, I think that it was relatively easy to convince people that we needed to build this, but it was harder to try and find the money to build it. So fortunately, we managed to get this charitable grant, which has supported the current phase of development. But we've identified new areas that we want to develop within the portal, particularly to try and make it more of an infrastructure that other networks can use. So yes, that's how we continue to fund new developments. I think will be an ongoing challenge. As far as the metadata schema goes, so we originally started looking at this by looking at something called MyAPI, the minimum information about plant phenotyping experiments, and we quite quickly found that it didn't really work how we wanted it to work for long-term experiments. So particularly with things like rotations, which currently aren't I don't think very well covered within things like MyAPI. So we started to develop the schema from that point of view. But very quickly, when it came to trying to describe the treatment factors that we wanted to gather, that very quickly became quite a difficult thing to describe. So I think there's still problems with the way that we're doing it, but it works for now. So there's still refinements we want to make. Another challenge as well have been around crop rotations. So the language for expressing crop rotations hadn't really been developed until we started looking at this project.
I see. Okay, I understand. So, and also because you one of the slides you also mentioned the steering committee, the governance structure of the initiative. So
Yes.
it'd be interested to know more about this, because especially when you show the demo, you were showing some around more than 20 different nodes around the world. So did you
Yeah.
reach out to all the key people or key organizations in those nodes to invite them to join the steering committee, or how did you come up with the, how were you able to get all these colleagues join the steering committee?
So we had, so a couple of years ago at Rothamsted, we had a conference to celebrate the 175th anniversary of the Broadwalk experiment. So we had quite a big long-term experiments conference, and I think nearly 200 attendees there. And sort of the core interest in the GLTEN as a project really developed there. So the people who are involved in the steering committee really have come from that initial core group. So there was a vote that we had earlier this year where people could nominate to go forward onto the committee and then be voted on. And so the 5 people that you see there are the top 5 nominees from that process.
Yes.
So in terms of reaching out now, so yeah, we're doing literature searches is one way. I think the best way that we've found for finding out about these experiments has been through conferences and presenting at conferences. So it's still very much that human networking seems to be the most effective way of developing the network.
Yes, I think that's really good insight you gave. I think hopefully, I hope this webinar, because it's recorded, and we will make sure it's sent to the wider community. If there are colleagues who are working in this long-term experiments who have not came across this initiative, hopefully some of them will contact you, and that will help you find more colleagues who are working in this area as well.
Yeah, that would be really good.
So I want to, because I haven't seen any other questions from the participants, so I would like to, and we are nearing our 1 hour time. So I want to thank Richard for his excellent presentation, and I also want to use this opportunity for all colleagues who are new to the agricultural data interest group to join our mail list, and it's free and open for everyone. And these webinars, as I mentioned before, this is the inaugural webinar, but this is the start of a webinar series where we want to bring together cutting edge developments in agriculture data and want to encourage the free flow of ideas. So we hope to offer them twice a month, scheduled at 2 different time zones, so that participants in all time zones can attend at least one of those 2 talks. And we will make sure all these webinars are recorded and posted as well. So those colleagues who couldn't attend can listen to them later at their convenience later as well. So if you have any, we welcome ideas from all colleagues who want to, any inputs on how on this webinar series. Please inform through the IGAD mail list as well. So your inputs are very welcome. And I also want to thank some of the key colleagues who worked to make this possible, especially colleagues from FAO, Cristiano Consolani and Karna Wegner from FAO who hosted this webinar series for us, and all the chairs of the IGAT working group, Ima, so we all Ima Subratis, Cynthia Parr, and Patricia Burton. So they are the chairs of the IGAT working group. So they are the ones who started this initiative. This was based from a RDA's plenary meeting 14 in Finland last month. That was decided to start this webinar series. So we are really happy, and I'm very grateful to all participants of today's webinar who have joined us for this first webinar. And I want to also thank Richard for being our first presenter for this webinar series, and also the organizers of the webinar series. So we thank all of you, and we look forward to see you in our future webinars. We will have another webinar in December. The exact date and time as well as the presentation details will be sent through the IGAD main mail list. So the mail list, if you want to join the mail list, the details are in the chat window as well. So Cristiano has sent the link of that IGAD community. So please, if you are new to IGAD, I will definitely request you to please go through our website and join our mail list, because all the communications and all the updates, even the recording of this webinar, we will make sure it's posted through that mail list as well. So, I want to again thank all of you for joining today's webinar, and we look forward to seeing you in one of our future webinars. Thank you all. Bye for now.